Sadly, there has been two atrocities in Egypt today, um, in the cities of Tanta and Alexandria, both targeted at the Coptic Christian minority. Now, this is particularly cruel because today, yesterday now, was Palm Sunday, which of course is an important event in the Christian calendar. The latest information is that over 40 people have died. This makes this one of the worst attacks on Coptic Christians in Egypt. Um, the Islamic State, so called, has claimed responsibility. At least 45 people were killed and more than 136 injured. And the targets were specifically because they were Coptic Christian centers. Alexandria is the seat of the Coptic papacy. President Sisi summoned the country's Security Council, and as I understand it, there's an emergency meeting going on regarding the situation. Egypt, of course, is no stranger to terrorism. There's an ongoing violent insurgency in Sinai. Um, but sadly, persecution of the Christian Coptic minority there is nothing new. 2011, Alexandria saw a church bombing. Over 20 people were killed, and there's been a long, grim list of massacres carried out against the Christian minority in Egypt. Um, One of the things I heard today was that there were also Muslims killed. I think everyone agrees that ISIS is a vicious death cult, with utter disregard for human life. And I've no doubt there probably were Muslim victims as well. But it is absolutely irrefutable, that there is a deeply entrenched systematic persecution of minorities, and particular Christians, in Islamic majority countries. Now, President Sisi is no Islamist, and he understands the level of this threat. I'm not going to come out and say I'm a huge fan of Sisi. Um, I think he has dictatorial tendencies, and I think we have to be careful about praising, a guy who could be a future Mubarak, or well, he arguably already is. Um, but in countries like Egypt, where you have the systematic persecution, I could see similar situations in Pakistan and really across, particularly across the Middle East, but frankly across the Islamic world now. It is what it is. There isn't really a great deal more to say, except that it's appalling. Today there was a clash between the EDL and, yes, I should say, between the EDL and Birmingham Central Mosque. Now, Birmingham Central Mosque apparently had a British event. They had the Union flag on the outside of the mosque, and they were offering tea and cake. Making it very British. Fair play to them. Um, but the comments were very much directed against the ADL. Now, I'm not a fan of the ADL, as I've exemplified in the video I made specifically about that. But I still get the impression that in Western countries, we still have this deeply, deeply entrenched notion that Islamophobia is is on a sort of moral equilibrium to what is going on in the Islamic world. I think this is deeply misguided. Let me be very, very clear here. I will always, always condemn individual incidents of hate crime against Muslims. And I will never endorse a view that says all Muslims are this or that. I will never endorse that sort of view against any group. But the attempts to make moral comparisons are utterly absurd. If you think the EDL is comparable to ISIS, you're just deluded. The EDL may be an unpleasant organization, and I don't approve of the methods they use. And they do have some very unsavory characters in their midst. There's no question about that. There's no question they have white supremacists in the ranks. But until they carry out a large scale terrorist attack, let's say, for example, I mean, put it this way, what's happened today in Egypt would be the equivalent of the ADL blowing up a mosque on Eid and causing mass fatalities. Imagine, imagine the backlash that would come from that. But this is something Christians in the Middle East have to face all the time. It's been condemned by world leaders. It's been condemned by Pope Francis, and in typical papal fashion, he's been very um, sensitive in his words and very compassionate towards the victims. Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has also condemned this. Um, and I've no doubt there are Muslim leaders who will unreservedly condemn it as well. But this situation is just a fact. Not long ago, there was an elderly Christian woman stripped naked because of a misunderstanding or some clash that her son had had with Muslims over his girlfriend. This is a situation that is irrefutable. When I look around the world, the only example I can think of, honestly, where there is systematic persecution against Muslims for being Muslims is in Burma against the Rohingya people. You do get examples of pogroms in India against Muslims, but I would suggest that the difference is that with Islamic supremacism, it's far more international, it's far more widespread. When I make these videos, I have no intention of downplaying extremism in other religions. But I am adamant that there is a different situation with Islam. Because the extremism you get in other religions it's certainly there, and you get it in all the major religions. None of them can claim innocence. I actually unfriended a guy yesterday who's a critic of Islamic extremism. I think he was I don't know where he was from, but judging by his name, I think he was Pakistani. Actually, no, I unfriended him because he made a statement implying that he might be an Indian. In fact, I honestly don't know. I wasn't connected with him long enough to find that out. But I unfriended him because he said Hinduism is perfect. There are no extreme Hindus. Now that's rubbish. Of course, there's extreme Hindus, and I don't want to be connected with people who are that short-sighted. But I am beyond fed up with left wingers in Western countries trying to make it's not that they necessarily downplay it. It's not that they say Islam is perfect, there's no problems, but they make these ridiculous analogies like there's any sort of rational comparison between the ADL having an unsavory protest and an atrocity targeted against a religious minority, an atrocity in which 45 people have died. So that's why I'm really critical of terms like Islamophobia, because I honestly believe those terms are used by the regressive left. I'm not talking about left wingers in general, but people who want to downplay the reality of this. Therefore, it's a term that is used to try and silence anyone criticizing Islam. I've been very vocal about Islamism, but I also would extend that to say Islam itself should not be above criticism. Because you get a situation, for example, in countries like Pakistan, you'll get lots of people will condemn ISIS, okay? But the same people, you push them a bit further, ask their views on apostates, ask their views on what punishment there should be for adulteresses, and for that, rape victims. When you push those sort of questions, you'll find that many of these people are opposed to ISIS because it's very easy to do that. But when you actually push into ideology within the religion, there are some serious problems. So no one will convince me that Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance. I just don't think it is. Do I think there are peaceful, tolerant Muslims? Absolutely. I know a few. I know Muslims who are thoroughly decent people. They are, I like them on a personal basis. They're certainly not extremists. Um, but if they argue that Islam doesn't have internal problems, they're kidding themselves. And I feel so frustrated with the biggest problem in the West is not from Islamism, it's from those who downplay it. Now, I understand the argument that terrorists want attention. I get that. But I do believe this goes beyond terrorism. I believe it goes into culture and values as well. As far as I'm concerned, we have to get this right. So, for example, in regards to immigration, when people come to our borders, and it isn't just about Islam, it's about cultural values in general, because there's other issues. For example, I would take a zero tolerance approach to any sort of caste discrimination. I would take a zero tolerance approach to any sort of defensive honor killings. And that isn't something unique to Islam, actually. But in the West, we are spineless still. Leaders will always talk tough when terrorist attacks happen. Like we're going to stand up for our values. They won't divide us. It's like I'm not saying those things are not important, but there is issues at play here. And unfortunately, the regressive left have just shown themselves to be utterly, utterly, utterly pathetic, in my opinion. It's just, I mean, I just can't understand the mindset of someone who is more offended by the ADL than by what happened today in Egypt. And people might say, oh, well, that's another country. That's why we're not so concerned. But the very same mentality pervades in the likes of Khalid Masood and whoever the individual or group was responsible for the Stockholm attack. This mentality is exported. Islamism is Islamic imperialism. I think that would be a fair way to describe it because that is the goal. It's about creating a caliphate. That's why it's fundamentally different from other terrorist groups in the past. The BBC had that question: what is different from terrorist groups in Europe in the past and Islamic groups today, Islamist groups today? The IRA and ETA were guilty of atrocities. They were terrorist organizations, but they were territorial groups. They were never religious fanatics. I do think there's a difference. Right, I'll leave it there. This is going to be a long, long road. I honestly think we're seeing a Cold War type situation with Islamism. I don't hate Muslims, and I will always, always condemn genuine hatred or aggression towards Muslim people. I will always condemn that. But I will simply not endorse this mentality that talking about problems within Islam is Islamophobic. If someone gets up and says they hate all Muslims, I think that's problematic. I don't think it's that sort of mentality should be challenged. But the mindset of certain people on the left, I'm not talking about everyone, but those who make these moral equilibriums and they're just so so dishonest, or worse than dishonesty, they have convinced themselves that their naivety is correct, that they're virtue signaling. The idea that multiculturalism, I used to be an advocate for multiculturalism. I used to think, oh, it's wonderful. Let's all get in a nice circle, shake hands. It's it's the most naive, short-sighted social program, if I can put it that way, that there is. It's just so naive. And the point I would make is the opposite of multiculturalism isn't blood and soil nationalism. It's not all white societies. I would never endorse that. In fact, I would hate that. I would argue there is a difference between diversity and multiculturalism. You can have diversity, but a diversity that respects the values of the host nation. Multiculturalism doesn't, because by definition, if you're a blind supporter of multiculturalism in that you think it is a good thing no matter what. By extension, you support honor killings, and there's no way around that. Okay, I hope this emergency summit in Egypt produces something, and I hope President Sisi can really guarantee better security for, it's a difficult situation, especially in a country of over 80 million people. Um, but this is unacceptable, and I do think Western secular government should be outspoken in saying it's unacceptable that religious minorities are persecuted in this way. Thanks for watching.